Commander Daveth Kraine had negotiated trade agreements in asteroid mining operations, where the air smelled like sulfur and desperation. He'd brokered ceasefires in war rooms where the temperature controls had failed, and everyone's temper ran as hot as the malfunctioning life support. He'd even survived a 3-day diplomatic dinner with the Corthian Collective, whose idea of cuisine involved things that were still technically moving on the plate. None of it had prepared him for the Meridian Archive. The library ship materialized out of the Veil Nebula like a fever dream someone had carved from frozen starlight. Kraine watched it through the forward viewport of the Terran shuttle, trying to catalog what he was seeing in terms that would make sense in his mission report later. Crystalline structure, he thought. Bioluminescent information lattice, approximately 8 kilometers in length, but the clinical language felt like trying to describe a symphony by listing the instruments. "Sir, I think the ship just winked at us," Lieutenant Amara Chen said from the pilot's seat. "Ships don't wink, Lieutenant. This one did. I have it on sensors. A whole section just pulsed in what I can only describe as a friendly manner." Kraine rubbed his temples. 3 hours into first contact with the Veilani Collective, and already his crew was anthropomorphizing their architecture. He made a mental note to check the oxygen mixture in the shuttle when they got back. The docking procedure involved more trust than Kraine was comfortable with. The Meridian Archive simply opened a portion of its hull and swallowed their shuttle whole, sealing behind them with a sound like wind chimes made of diamond. When the airlock pressurized, Kraine checked his tactical visor's readouts twice. Breathable atmosphere, standard gravity, temperature slightly cooler than human comfortable. Nothing immediately fatal. "Well," Chen said, unstrapping from her seat. "If they wanted us dead, there are easier ways." "Comforting thought, Lieutenant. Put it in the log." The escort arrived before Kraine could finish his third equipment check. 2 Veilani guards, or at least he assumed they were guards based on the way they carried themselves with that particular blend of alertness and boredom universal to security personnel across all known species. They were tall, blue-skinned, their ears swept back in elegant points that reminded Kraine of ancient Earth mythology. One of them spoke in flawless Terran standard, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was translating in real time through some mechanism Kraine couldn't identify. "Commander Kraine, Ambassador Sylith welcomes you to the Meridian Archive. She awaits in the Grand Observatory." They walked through corridors that shouldn't exist. The walls were transparent in places, revealing information streams that flowed like luminescent rivers through the ship's infrastructure. Kraine caught glimpses of text in languages he didn't recognize, mathematical formulas that hurt to look at directly. What appeared to be memories crystallized into geometric shapes that rotated slowly in their display cases. His tactical visor tried to record everything and gave up after the first 100 meters, defaulting to an error message that translated roughly to insufficient context for analysis. "How much of this can we actually read?" he asked. "The archive contains the collected knowledge of 47 species," the guard replied. 12 are extinct. You may read anything that your biology permits you to comprehend. The ambassador will explain the access protocols. And the species that are extinct. Their knowledge remains. We are merely the current custodians." Chen caught his eye and mouthed the word creepy, with enough exaggeration that Kraine had to fight down a smile. Professional, diplomatic. He was here to negotiate data-sharing agreements, not critique the Veilani's approach to library science, no matter how unsettling it felt to walk through a museum of dead civilizations. The Grand Observatory occupied the archive's central axis. Kraine stepped through the entrance and immediately regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. The floor was transparent, completely, perfectly transparent. Below his boots, the Veil Nebula sprawled in shades of violet and amber, and colors his brain kept trying to process as blue but weren't quite, stretched across a distance that made his sense of scale give up entirely. "Oh, absolutely not," Chen said behind him. "Sir, Permission to remain in the corridor where floors are floors and not existential nightmares. Denied. If I'm doing this, you're doing this. I hate diplomatic missions. Noted and logged. Ambassador Sylith stood at the center of the observation deck with her back to them, looking down into the nebula like someone studying a painting in a gallery. She turned as they approached, and Kraine's carefully prepared greeting lodged somewhere in his throat and refused to emerge in any coherent form. She was blue-skinned like the guards, but where their features had been merely striking, hers carried something that bypassed his professional assessment entirely and went straight to a much older, much less diplomatic part of his brain. Her hair was blonde, catching the nebula's light and scattering it in ways that suggested it might be naturally bioluminescent. Her ears swept back in those same elegant points. And her eyes, fractured starlight was the only description that made sense, as if someone had taken a binary star system and compressed it into human approximate eyes that reflected too many colors simultaneously. She smiled. It was a perfectly professional smile. Kraine told himself it was a perfectly professional smile. "Commander Kraine," she said. Her voice carried those same harmonics as the guards, but richer somehow, like listening to music through better speakers. "Welcome to the Meridian Archive. I trust your journey through the Veil was uneventful. As uneventful as navigating a stellar nursery can be, Ambassador." His voice worked. Thank every star in the nebula, his voice actually worked. "Your archive is impressive. It serves its purpose." She gestured to the holographic display that materialized between them, a three-dimensional schematic of proposed data-sharing protocols that Kraine's team had transmitted weeks ago. "Shall we begin with the mundane bureaucracy of interstellar agreements? I find it helps to establish common ground before addressing the more interesting complications." Kraine's tactical visor adjusted to the bright holographic display, its reflective surface catching the ambient light. He was grateful for it suddenly. A barrier, however thin, between his carefully controlled expression and those impossible eyes. What he couldn't see was his own reflection in that visor's surface, or the way Ambassador Sylith's smile deepened, just slightly, when she glanced at it. The second day of negotiations began with Kraine walking face first into a wall that wasn't there. "The archive adjusts its internal geometry based on informational density," Sylith explained. Watching him rub his nose with what he suspected was concealed amusement. "That corridor existed yesterday. Today the knowledge it contained migrated to a different section, so the corridor ceased to be necessary." "Wonderful," Kraine muttered. "A ship with architectural opinions." "All ships have opinions, Commander. Most simply lack the capacity to express them through radical structural reorganization." Chen, who had managed to avoid the invisible wall through either superior reflexes or cowardice, depending on how charitable Kraine felt, was consulting her portable scanner with increasing distress. "Sir, according to this, our quarters moved 300 meters to port while we slept. Did they move us with them, or did we wake up in a different location? I'm afraid to check." The observation deck had remained mercifully stationary, still offering its vertiginous view of the nebula below. Kraine had spent his first night aboard the archive trying not to think about that transparent floor, or the fact that the Veilani apparently considered privacy a quaint cultural affectation. His assigned quarters featured walls that were only semi-opaque, showing silhouettes of passing crew members like ghosts in a very expensive aquarium. He'd hung his uniform jacket over the worst of it and tried to sleep, while the archive hummed around him with sounds that might have been engines or might have been the ship singing to itself. Sylith was already waiting when they arrived, standing exactly where she'd stood yesterday, as if she'd never left. She probably hadn't. Kraine had read the briefing materials on Veilani biology. They required minimal sleep, entering brief meditative states instead of the prolonged unconsciousness humans needed. It seemed profoundly unfair that she looked this composed, while he was operating on 4 hours of fitful rest and station coffee, that tasted like someone had strained it through old socks. "We should discuss the cultural exchange protocols today," she said, gesturing to a new set of holographic documents that bloomed between them like luminescent flowers. "Your proposal suggests a limit of 50 scholars per cycle. I find this number arbitrary. It's based on available transport capacity and quarantine requirements," Kraine replied, grateful to focus on something concrete and bureaucratic. "We need to ensure biological compatibility before large-scale exchanges." "Ah yes, your species' charming paranoia about microbial contamination." She tilted her head, and her hair caught the light in that distracting way it had. "The Villani have more efficient decontamination methods. I could demonstrate if you'd like." "That won't be necessary, Ambassador." "Pity, the process involves full-spectrum cellular resonance. Most humans find it pleasant. Some find it intensely pleasant." Chen made a sound behind him that might have been a cough or might have been a suppressed laugh. Kraine didn't turn around to check. He kept his eyes on the holographic documents, watching data scroll past in both Terran Standard and the flowing Villani script that looked like someone had taught cursive to a mathematical equation. "Perhaps we could table the decontamination discussion," he suggested. "As you wish. Tell me, Commander, do all human negotiations involve this much careful avoidance of direct communication? It's fascinating from an anthropological perspective. We prefer to call it professionalism." "Of course you do." The morning stretched into afternoon, measured by the slow rotation of the nebula below them. Kraine found himself hyper-aware of spatial relationships, how Sylith moved around the holographic display, the precise distance she maintained, the way she'd angle her body when making a point. It was all perfectly appropriate, perfectly professional, and yet he kept finding his attention drawn to the sweep of her ears, the way her hands traced patterns in the air when she explained complex concepts, the fact that her eyes seemed to shift color slightly depending on what she was looking at. His tactical visor dutifully recorded everything, its reflective surface a mirror between his face and the rest of the universe. Safe behind it, he could maintain his diplomatic mask, or so he told himself. "Commander, you've been staring at the same subsection of the Cultural Artifact Protection Clause for approximately 8 minutes, Sylith observed. "Is there a particular concern, or have you discovered something profoundly moving about export tariffs?" Kraine blinked. The holographic text swam back into focus, just being thorough. "Thorough, yes." She smiled that professional smile again. "The Villani value thoroughness, though we tend to apply it more directly." "Different species, different approaches." "Indeed, different approaches to many things, I imagine." There was something in her tone that Kraine couldn't quite parse. He risked a glance up from the documents and found her watching him with an expression of polite interest that somehow felt like she was solving an equation in real time and finding the results amusing. "Should we break for the midday rest period?" he suggested. "My team would benefit from reviewing these proposals in our quarters." "Certainly. Although I should mention that the Archive's environmental systems are scheduled for maintenance in the human-compatible sectors this afternoon. A minor atmospheric recalibration. Nothing dangerous, but the oxygen mixture will be slightly richer than usual. Some species find it mildly intoxicating, your people included." "How mildly?" "Comparable to what you call half a glass of wine. Perhaps 3/4 if you're particularly sensitive. The Archive's medical database suggests humans become more honest under such conditions. We find it useful for fostering transparent dialogue." Chen leaned close enough to whisper, "Sir, I think the ship is trying to get us drunk." "Noted, Lieutenant." Sylith's smile widened fractionally. "I assure you, Commander, the maintenance is entirely routine. Though if you'd prefer to relocate to a Villani-compatible section during the repairs, you're welcome to join me in the memory galleries. I promise the atmosphere there is perfectly safe." Kraine looked at her, then at the transparent floor beneath his feet, then at the infinite nebula beyond. He thought about his carefully maintained professional distance, his tactical visor's faithful recordings, and the increasingly obvious fact that nothing about this negotiation was going according to any protocol he'd ever studied. The memory galleries, he heard himself say, that would be acceptable. Behind him, Chen muttered something that sounded like a prayer to whatever deity protected foolish commanders from their own decisions. The final day of negotiations proceeded with excruciating normality. Kraine and Sylith reviewed data access protocols, discussed archaeological expedition timelines, and debated the finer points of cultural preservation standards with the kind of professional detachment that made everything that had happened in the memory gallery feel like a hallucination brought on by oxygen intoxication and poor judgment. Chen kept giving him significant looks across the holographic displays. Kraine ignored her with the dedication of a man clinging to the last shreds of his composure. The Terran Coalition agrees to your terms regarding artifact repatriation, he said, watching legal text scroll past in both languages, provided we maintain joint custody during the initial research phase. Acceptable, Sylith replied. She hadn't mentioned the visor, hadn't acknowledged that she'd casually demolished his carefully maintained professional distance with a single observation about reflective surfaces. She stood on the other side of the holographic display looking perfectly composed, and Kraine found himself simultaneously grateful and irrationally annoyed by her restraint. I believe that concludes the primary negotiations, she continued. Both our governments should be satisfied with the protocols we've established. Well done, Commander. You've been remarkably focused despite the Archive's various distractions. There was absolutely nothing in her tone to suggest innuendo, which somehow made it worse. Thank you, Ambassador. Your hospitality has been exemplary. Has it? I worried the environmental system's malfunction might have caused discomfort. No lasting damage. I'm relieved to hear it. She gestured, and the holographic displays collapsed into points of light that drifted away like startled fish. There is one final tradition we should observe before you depart. The Villani formalize agreements with a moment of private acknowledgement. It's considered essential, a reminder that behind all bureaucracy and protocol, we're simply beings attempting to understand each other. Kraine's tactical visor helpfully increased his heart rate display. He dismissed it with a subvocal command. Where does this acknowledgement take place? The exterior observation platform. It extends directly into space. No ship hull, no barriers, just two individuals and the universe. She tilted her head slightly. Your briefing materials should have mentioned it. Page 47, I believe. Chen coughed. Sir, I think I skimmed that section. Lieutenant, you were supposed to read the entire briefing. In my defense, sir, page 47 described something so terrifying I assumed it was a translation error. Sylith's expression suggested she was enjoying this far too much. I assure you, Lieutenant, the translation was accurate, though participation is entirely voluntary. Commander Kraine is welcome to decline if the prospect of standing on transparent nothing while surrounded by infinite vacuum proves too distressing. Every diplomatic instinct Kraine possessed screamed that declining would insult their hosts, undermine the negotiations, and probably feature prominently in his performance review as evidence of insufficient cultural sensitivity. Every survival instinct suggested that standing on a platform with no visible means of support, while separated from hard vacuum by nothing but Villani technology and optimism, was a spectacularly bad idea. I accept, he said, because apparently 3 days aboard the Meridian Archive had eroded his common sense beyond repair. Excellent. This way. The walk to the airlock felt like a funeral march. Chen accompanied them, muttering about updating her will and wondering if the Terran Coalition provided death benefits for diplomatic missions gone wrong. The airlock itself was a crystalline chamber that somehow looked both ancient and impossible, covered in symbols that Kraine suspected were instructions but might equally have been decorative warnings about hubris. The environmental shields will generate breathable atmosphere around you, Sylith explained. You'll feel slight pressure, as if standing in a gentle wind. Don't fight it. The shields interpret resistance as a breach threat and compensate accordingly. People who panic tend to find themselves in localized high-pressure bubbles until they calm down. Has anyone ever panicked? Kraine asked. The Korthian ambassador required sedation, but Korthians panic about everything. You'll be fine. Your confidence is inspiring, Ambassador. I know. The airlock cycled. Kraine watched the inner door seal behind them and the outer door iris open onto nothing, onto space, onto the Veil Nebula spreading across existence like someone had shattered a stained glass window depicting creation itself. His tactical visor immediately gave up trying to process what it was seeing and defaulted to a blank display that he suspected was the visual equivalent of a shrug. Sylith stepped onto the platform first, her movements easy and unconcerned. The environmental shield shimmered into existence around her, a barely visible distortion in space that suggested breathable atmosphere through mechanisms Kraine didn't want to examine too closely. "Commander," she said, holding out her hand again. "It's easier if you don't look down initially." He took her hand, stepped forward, felt his boot touch transparent, something that held his weight despite every instinct screaming that he was about to plummet into infinity. The environmental shield wrapped around him like lukewarm water, pressure without temperature, and suddenly he could breathe vacuum as easily as station air. "Oh, this is obscene," he said. "Most humans use stronger language. You're very restrained. I'm having an internal crisis. Give me a moment." She laughed, and the sound carried strangely through the environmental shields, as if they were standing in a cathedral made of nothing. Below them, though down had ceased to have any meaningful definition, the Veil Nebula burned in colors that made his eyes water. Stars wheeled past in patterns that suggested the archive was rotating, or the universe was, or possibly both. "This is where we formalize our agreements," Sylith said. Her hand was still in his, and he hadn't realized he'd been holding it tight enough to hurt. "Where we acknowledge what we've accomplished together. Where we're honest about what exists between us beyond protocols and professional distance." Kraine forced himself to meet her eyes. Those fractured starlight eyes that caught the nebula's light and scattered it into colors that didn't exist in any human language. "Ambassador, so you like my body?" The question landed like a meteor strike. Kraine's brain, already struggling with the concept of standing on nothing while breathing vacuum, simply stopped processing for several seconds. "I what?" "Your eyes. I've been watching them in your visor's reflection for 3 days. You look at me the way someone looks at art they want to own but know they can't touch." She said it calmly, matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "I'm curious if you'll finally admit it now, that we're standing in a place where lies feel particularly inappropriate." The memory gallery smelled like copper and electricity, and something Kraine's brain kept insisting was cinnamon, even though that made no sense whatsoever. Chen had elected to remain in their oxygen-rich quarters, claiming she needed to review the morning's proposals, though Kraine suspected she just wanted to see if the environmental systems really would make her tipsy. He'd assigned her documentation duties, and tried not to think about how that left him alone with Sylith in a section of the archive that seemed to exist partially outside normal geometry. "The Velani collect memories the way your species collects physical artifacts," Sylith said, leading him between displays that pulsed with soft light. "We consider them more honest than any written history. A society's first kiss, first murder, first realization that they're not alone in the universe. These are the true records of what they were." "Seems invasive," Kraine said. The oxygen mixture was definitely richer here. His head felt pleasantly light, like he'd just crested the first hill of a roller coaster, taking someone's memories without permission. "We only take what's offered, or what remains after they're gone." She stopped before a spherical structure that rotated slowly in midair, its surface covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This is our newest acquisition, a species called the Mornth. They achieved spaceflight, reached their nearest moon, and experienced something there that changed them fundamentally. This is that moment, preserved exactly as they felt it. What happened to them? They transcended, uploaded themselves into a quantum substrate and departed physical reality entirely. Very inconsiderate of them, they left behind excellent coffee. She gestured to the sphere. Would you like to experience it? The memory, not the coffee. Though I can arrange the coffee if you're interested. Kraine stared at the rotating sphere. His tactical training screamed warnings about unknown alien technology and potential psychological contamination. His diplomatic briefing suggested that refusing might be culturally offensive. And something else, something loosened by the oxygen-rich air, whispered that he'd come this far already and might as well see what happened next. How does it work? We enter together, the memory surrounds us. You'll experience what they experienced, sight, sound, emotion, all of it. Don't fight it. The resistance causes discomfort. She held out her hand. Physical contact helps anchor participants to reality. The memories can be overwhelming for first-timers. Her hand hung in the space between them. Kraine looked at it, then at her face, then at his tactical visor's reflection, where he could see his own uncertain expression staring back. This is part of standard diplomatic procedure, he asked. Commander, nothing about this negotiation has been standard. I assumed you'd noticed. Fair point. He took her hand. Her skin was cooler than human normal, smooth, except for what felt like very fine ridges along her palm. Her fingers closed around his with surprising strength. Then she stepped forward into the sphere and pulled him with her. The grand observatory vanished. Kraine stood on a lunar surface under a sky that was wrong, two suns setting in opposite directions, casting shadows that intersected at impossible angles. Except he wasn't Kraine anymore. He was Mornth, his body smaller and covered in something that might have been scales or might have been crystallized thought. His companions stood beside him, 3 of them, their names resonating in his mind as harmonics rather than sounds. They traveled here in a vessel held together with prayer and mathematics, and now they watched their home planet eclipse one of the suns and understood, finally, truly, how small they were and how infinite everything else was. The terror hit first, then the wonder, then something that had no name in any human language, a sensation of doors opening in his consciousness that he hadn't known were closed. His companions felt it too. They were changing, right there on that alien moon, their bodies beginning to shimmer at the edges as if they were becoming light or thought or something that existed between the two. Kraine tried to hold on to himself, to remember he was human, Terran, Commander Daveth Kraine with 17 years of military service, and a coffee addiction, and a crew waiting back on the shuttle. But the memory pulled at him, showing him what it felt like to transcend, to leave physical form behind and become something that existed in pure pattern and possibility. Then Sylith's hand tightened around his, and suddenly he could feel his own body again, his lungs breathing air that was too rich and too thin simultaneously, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lunar surface faded. The grand observatory reassembled around them in fragments that took too long to solidify. Breathe, Sylith said. Her other hand had found his shoulder, steadying him. Breathe and remember which body is yours. Kraine gasped, his tactical visor's displays swimming with error messages, as it tried to reconcile sensor data that insisted he'd just been in 2 places simultaneously. He realized he was gripping Sylith's arm hard enough to hurt, but she didn't pull away. That, he managed eventually, was significantly more than I expected. Most humans say something less articulate. You should hear what the Corthians say, though it's mostly screaming. I thought about screaming. I know I could feel it. She was still holding his shoulder, her face closer than it had been before they'd entered the memory. You did well. Most first-timers panic. I panicked internally, very quietly, with dignity. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. a sound with those same harmonic undertones that made his reconstructed human nervous system light up in ways that had nothing to do with transcendent alien memories. "Your species' obsession with dignity is endearing," she said. "Even when you're terrified, you maintain these elaborate performances." "It's not a performance, isn't it?" Her hand slipped from his shoulder but remained close, hovering in the space between his body and hers. "You've been performing for 3 days, Commander, very skillfully, very carefully, as if I can't see exactly what you're trying so hard to hide." The oxygen-rich air suddenly felt very warm. Kraine's tactical visor helpfully informed him his heart rate had spiked again, which he absolutely did not need quantified at this particular moment. "Ambassador." "The visor," she interrupted gently. "It's reflective, did you know? I've been watching your eyes watch me for 3 days through that little mirror you think is hiding you." The environmental systems chose that moment to emit a harmonic chime, signaling their completion. The archive's ordinary atmosphere began filtering back through the gallery. Kraine felt the pleasant lightness drain from his head, replaced by something much worse, clarity. "We should return to the observation deck," he said, his voice remarkably steady for someone whose entire diplomatic foundation had just evaporated. "The afternoon session." "Of course." Sylith stepped back, creating professional distance with a precision that felt almost mocking. "Though you're still holding my hand, Commander." He was. He released it quickly, professionally, with all the dignity he could salvage. They walked back through the archive's shifting corridors in silence, but Kraine could feel her watching him in his visor's reflection, could see the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The denial died somewhere between Kraine's brain and his mouth. Below them, stars wheeled through their ancient choreography, utterly indifferent to human embarrassment or the sudden collapse of diplomatic pretense. He stood there, holding Sylith's hand on a platform made of optimism and alien engineering, and realized that lying, here, now, suspended in vacuum with nothing between them but truth and environmental shields, would be more insulting than anything he'd done so far. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, apparently I've been staring at you like an idiot for 3 days while congratulating myself on my professionalism. I assume this violates approximately 47 diplomatic protocols." 49 actually, I checked. She smiled, and it wasn't the professional smile anymore. "Why do your people make such simple things so complicated? You're attracted to me. I've known since the first day when you adjusted your stance 3 times, in the first minute trying to find an angle where you could look at me without feeling obvious about it. I thought the visor was hiding it. The visor was betraying you constantly. Reflective surfaces are terrible conspirators." She tilted her head, studying him with that expression of amused curiosity that had been slowly destroying his composure since they'd met. "The Villani don't have these elaborate shame structures around desire. When we want something, we acknowledge it. When we want someone, we tell them. Your species' approach is fascinating but exhausting to witness." Kraine laughed, a sound halfway between humor and hysteria. "It's not shame, it's professionalism. There are rules about this kind of thing during first contact scenarios. Power dynamics, potential for misunderstanding. The fact that I'm here representing my entire species and probably shouldn't spend negotiations fantasizing about," he caught himself. "I'm going to stop talking now." "Please don't. This is the most honest you've been since you arrived." The nebula behind her shifted from violet to amber, painting her skin in colors that made his already struggling brain surrender completely. "Tell me what your rules say. I'm genuinely curious how you've managed to take something as straightforward as mutual attraction and transform it into a crisis of professional ethics. Because it is a crisis, you're an ambassador, I'm a commander. We're establishing first contact between our civilizations. If I act on, if we," he gestured helplessly at the space between them, at the universe beyond, at the entire impossible situation. "There are procedures for this. Protocols. You don't just acknowledge attraction and see what happens. Why not? Because it's complicated. Only if you make it complicated. She stepped closer, though the environmental shields kept a shimmer of space between them. I told you, Commander. The Veilani value honesty. I've been waiting 3 days for you to catch up to something I knew the moment you walked onto the observation deck with your careful posture and your reflective visor and your absolute determination to pretend you weren't affected by me. I was affected, Kraine admitted. Catastrophically affected. I wrote 3 separate reports trying to justify requesting a replacement negotiator before I deleted them all. Why didn't you request one? Because I'm very good at my job, and because, he stopped, realizing he was standing at the edge of something that had nothing to do with the transparent platform beneath his feet. Because I wanted to stay. The confession hung between them like the stars beyond the archive's hull. Sylith watched him with those impossible eyes, and something in her expression shifted from amusement to something more complex. My people find human restraint both admirable and tragic, she said quietly. You build these elaborate walls between yourself and genuine feeling, then wonder why you're lonely. I chose this posting because I was tired of Veilani games. We're honest about desire, but we turn everything else into performance. My directness is considered extreme even among my own people, exhausting, too intense. She paused. You've spent 3 days trying not to want me. I've spent 3 days trying not to want someone who wouldn't want me honestly. Kraine stared at her. The nebula rotated behind her head like a halo made of burning gas and newborn stars. His tactical visor was still displaying nothing useful, which somehow felt appropriate for this entire conversation. I don't know what to do with this, he said finally. I don't have protocols for. He gestured again at the impossible everything surrounding them. Do you believe in possibilities that exist outside your carefully constructed rules? I'm a military commander negotiating first contact with an alien civilization, while standing on transparent, nothing-breathing vacuum held in place by technology I don't understand. I stopped believing in rules about 20 minutes ago. She laughed, genuine and bright. Then perhaps we can start there, with honesty instead of protocol, with acknowledgement instead of denial. She squeezed his hand. I'm attracted to you, Commander Kraine, to your restraint and your ridiculous dignity and the way you panic internally with such studied professionalism. I've known for 3 days. Now you know. We can't do anything about the fact that we're from incompatible worlds with incompatible rules and probably incompatible futures. But we can at least be honest about what existed here, in this moment, suspended between civilizations. Kraine looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, then at the infinite burning beyond them both. He thought about his carefully maintained distance, his tactical visor's faithful recordings, and the fact that nothing about this negotiation had followed any protocol he'd ever studied. He thought about the Mornth and their transcendence, about leaving behind one form of existence for something that existed between thought and possibility. I'm attracted to you, he said, and the words felt like stepping off another cliff. Catastrophically, inappropriately, in ways that will probably feature prominently in my psychological evaluation when I return. You're brilliant and direct, and you laugh at my disasters, and your eyes do something that makes my visor give up trying to categorize colors. I've been aware of you every moment for 3 days, and I'm still not sure if that's diplomacy or insanity. It's honest, Sylith said, finally. The archive hummed around them, its crystalline structure singing harmonics that might have been approval or might have been the ship's equivalent of laughter. Below them, the Veil Nebula continued its slow chromatic shift, indifferent to human complications and Veilani directness, and the small impossibility of 2 beings acknowledging desire across the infinite distance between their worlds. They stood there in silence, neither touching nor retreating, while the universe wheeled past and something that might have been understanding settled between them like starlight through vacuum. So, Kraine said eventually, do I pass the final tradition? With surprising honesty, though your delivery needs work. I'll add it to my diplomatic training recommendations. Chapter 47, subsection, How to Confess Attraction While Breathing Vacuum. She smiled, released his hand, and the professional distance returned, but different now acknowledged, a choice rather than a desperate defense. Your shuttle departs in 3 hours, Commander. I suggest you spend them with your crew instead of catastrophizing about protocol violations. We've established first contact successfully. The rest is simply what we choose to remember. They walked back through the airlock in silence, and when Chen asked later if everything went smoothly, Kraine simply said yes. The formalization was complete, and tried not to think about fractured starlight eyes or the sound of laughter carrying through environmental shields, or the moment he'd finally stopped lying to himself about what he wanted and started acknowledging what was real.